The champagne glass trembled slightly in Rebecca Martinez's weathered hand as she stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, her simple black dress and minimal jewelry making her nearly invisible among the sea of military dress uniforms and glittering evening gowns that filled the Pentagon's most prestigious annual gathering. But what the decorated officers and their spouses swirling around her in animated conversation didn't know was that this quiet woman with graying hair and modest appearance had once been the most feared operative in the Middle East, known only by her classified call sign Phantom 6, and that within the next hour. Her carefully guarded secret would be explosively revealed when an arrogant young major would publicly accuse her of stolen valor, only to watch in horror as the evening's guest of honor, a 4-star general, would recognize her instantly and call out the name that had once struck terror into the hearts of enemy combatants across 3 continents. Rebecca adjusted the thin silver chain around her neck, a simple piece that contained no visible pendant but held a small encrypted chip that even now, 5 years after her official retirement, marked her as someone who had operated in the deepest shadows of American intelligence. The Hotel Grand Washington's Crystal Ballroom buzzed with the refined energy of the military elite, its soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers creating an atmosphere of elegance that felt worlds away from the dusty compounds and urban warfare, zones where she had spent the better part of 2 decades. Officers in their dress blues mingled with civilians in formal wear, their conversations a mixture of military shop talk, political discussion, and the kind of social pleasantries that accompanied such high-level gatherings. She had almost declined the invitation when it arrived 3 weeks earlier, forwarded through a series of secure channels that maintained her current civilian identity. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Foundation's annual gala was typically reserved for high-ranking officials, Medal of Honor recipients, and distinguished service members whose contributions could be publicly acknowledged. Rebecca Martinez, as far as official records were concerned, had served 8 years as a communications specialist before taking an early discharge for family reasons. Her actual service record, buried under layers of classification that would remain sealed for decades, told a dramatically different story. The irony of her presence here wasn't lost on her. She had received the invitation because of her work with a small veterans assistance nonprofit, helping former service members transition to civilian careers. It was quiet, meaningful work that allowed her to use her understanding of military culture while maintaining the anonymity she had cultivated since leaving the shadows. Most of the veterans she helped assumed she was a former supply clerk or administrative specialist, someone who had served honorably but without the kind of combat experience that marked the warriors among them. She encouraged this assumption, finding safety in being underestimated. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the nonprofit's director and the only person present who knew Rebecca personally, approached with 2 fresh glasses of champagne. Patricia was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s whose own distinguished career in military intelligence had ended with a Pentagon posting and eventual retirement to charitable work. Unlike Rebecca, Patricia's achievements were fully documented and widely recognized, her chest full of ribbons and decorations telling the story of a conventional but highly successful military career. "You look like you're regretting coming," Patricia said with a knowing smile, offering Rebecca one of the glasses. "Still not comfortable with these formal affairs?" Rebecca accepted the champagne with a slight nod of thanks. "Old habits. I prefer to observe rather than participate in social gatherings." Her voice carried a slight accent that hinted at her New Mexico upbringing, though years of linguistic training had taught her to modulate her speech patterns depending on the operational requirements. Tonight, she sounded like exactly what she appeared to be, a middle-aged Hispanic woman who had served her country quietly and now worked in the nonprofit sector. "Well, you clean up nicely," Patricia continued, gesturing toward Rebecca's understated ensemble, "though I notice you're still wearing practical shoes." Rebecca glanced down at her black flats, chosen more for their silence and mobility than their fashion sense. Even in retirement, certain tactical considerations remained automatic. Some things never change. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. The ballroom continued to fill as the cocktail hour progressed. Rebecca recognized several faces from news broadcasts and military publications, senior Pentagon officials, recently retired generals, and a smattering of politicians who served on defense-related committees. The guest of honor for the evening was General Marcus Thompson, a four-star who had commanded joint operations across multiple theaters before his recent appointment as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His presence elevated the event's significance and explained the heightened security she had noticed upon entering the hotel. Near the center of the room, a group of younger officers had gathered around Major David Kellerman, a man in his early 30s whose perfectly pressed uniform and chest full of ribbons suggested either exceptional service or exceptional political connections. Kellerman's voice carried across the surrounding conversations as he regaled his audience with stories from his deployment to Afghanistan, his tone suggesting someone who had never learned the difference between confidence and arrogance. The problem with today's military, Kellerman was saying to his captive audience, is that we've lowered standards to accommodate political correctness. You've got people claiming combat experience who never left the wire, women pretending they were door kickers when they were really pushing papers behind the lines. Rebecca felt Patricia tense beside her at the comment, though she kept her own expression neutral. She had encountered Kellerman's type throughout her career, officers who had served competently in conventional roles, but who viewed the changing nature of warfare and military culture with suspicion and resentment. They were particularly hostile toward the idea that women might have contributed to combat operations in ways that didn't fit traditional masculine stereotypes of warfare. "Take that woman over there," Kellerman continued, gesturing vaguely in their direction, though his attention seemed focused elsewhere. "I guarantee you she's another one of these stolen valor cases. Shows up to military events, probably claims she was some kind of special operations hero when she was really filing paperwork in Kuwait." Rebecca followed his gaze and realized with a cold shock that he was pointing toward a woman near the bar whose appearance bore certain similarities to her own, middle-aged, Hispanic, dressed conservatively, and standing somewhat apart from the main social clusters. The woman wore a simple ribbon on her dress that indicated Purple Heart recognition, though she seemed uncomfortable with the attention it drew. "You can always tell," Kellerman added with the authority of someone who believed his own expertise. "Real operators don't need to advertise their service. These wannabes always overcompensate with stories they can't verify and medals they didn't earn." Patricia's hand tightened on her champagne glass, her knuckles showing white. As someone who had worked extensively with classified personnel, she understood better than most how many genuine heroes were forced to hide their achievements behind cover stories and false backgrounds. The assumption that quiet service meant lesser service was not just wrong, but dangerous to the operational security that kept such individuals alive. "That's quite an accusation," Patricia said coolly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of military leadership. "Perhaps you should be more careful about making assumptions regarding people's service records." Kellerman turned toward them with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes, clearly recognizing Patricia's rank from her posture and bearing even though she wore civilian clothes. "Colonel Hayes, isn't it? I've read your work on intelligence. Coordination. Impressive career." "Thank you, Major. And you might want to consider that not all impressive careers are publicly documented." The exchange drew attention from nearby guests, creating the kind of social tension that made civilian attendees uncomfortable, while military personnel automatically began choosing sides. Rebecca found herself caught between her instinct to fade into the background and her growing irritation at Kellerman's casual dismissal of veterans whose service he couldn't possibly understand. "The truth is," Kellerman continued, emboldened by his audience, "we've got a real problem in the veteran community with people inflating their service. Support personnel claiming they were combat troops, our EMFs pretending they were door kickers. It diminishes the sacrifice of those who actually bled for this country." His words hung in the air like a challenge, and Rebecca felt the familiar combat awareness that had kept her alive through countless missions beginning to sharpen her focus. She recognized the signs of a confrontation building, the way conversations around them began to slow as people sensed the tension. In her operational days, this would have been the moment to assess threats, identify exits, and prepare for multiple contingencies. Instead, she took a careful sip of her champagne and continued to observe, knowing that sometimes the most dangerous thing she could do was draw attention to herself. But Kellerman wasn't finished, and his next words would force her hand in ways that would shatter the carefully constructed anonymity she had maintained for 5 years. "Take someone like her," he said, and this time there was no doubt he was pointing directly at Rebecca. "I guarantee you she's got some sob story about how her records are classified or she can't talk about what she did. Classic stolen valor. Playbook." The accusation hit the gathering like a physical blow, conversations stopping as heads turned to follow Kellerman's gesture. Rebecca felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on her, the kind of attention she had spent years learning to avoid. Her training told her to deflect, to make excuses and withdraw from the situation before it escalated further. But something in Kellerman's tone, the casual certainty with which he dismissed not just her service, but the service of countless others who had sacrificed in silence, triggered a response that surprised even her. Instead of retreating, she straightened slightly, her posture shifting in ways that only a trained observer would notice, but that transformed her from invisible bystander to someone worth watching. "Major Kellerman," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the suddenly hushed ballroom, "you seem very confident in your assessment of people you've never met." The direct challenge caught him off guard, clearly not expecting resistance from someone he had dismissed as a pretender. His expression shifted from casual arrogance to something harder, more calculating. "Ma'am, I've been around long enough to recognize the signs. Real veterans don't need to prove anything to anyone." "No," Rebecca agreed, setting down her champagne glass with deliberate precision, "they don't. But apparently some veterans feel the need to diminish others to elevate themselves." The response drew murmurs from the surrounding crowd, a mixture of approval and concern as the confrontation escalated beyond social awkwardness into something more serious. Rebecca was aware of Patricia moving closer, ready to intervene, but also of other faces in the crowd beginning to show interest. Military personnel had an instinctive reaction to conflict, especially when it involved questions of honor and service. Kellerman's face flushed slightly, recognizing that he had miscalculated in choosing his target. "I'm simply pointing out that there are people at events like this who trade on false narratives about their service. It's disrespectful to those who actually earned their place here." "And how exactly do you determine who has earned their place, Major?" The question was delivered in the same quiet tone, but there was something underneath it now that made several nearby officers unconsciously straighten their postures. Rebecca's body language had shifted almost imperceptibly from defensive to something that suggested coiled energy, though she remained perfectly still. "Experience, ma'am. I know what real combat veterans look like, how they carry themselves, how they talk about their service. And with all due respect, you don't fit the profile." The insult was delivered with military courtesy, but its intent was unmistakable. Rebecca felt the familiar cold calm that had once made her one of the most effective operators in the field settling over her consciousness. In the old days, this would have been the moment when Phantom 6 began to plan her response, calculating angles and vulnerabilities with the precision of a weapon system acquiring targets. Instead, she simply nodded once, acknowledging his assessment without confirming or denying it. I see. And what profile should I fit, exactly? The question hung in the charged atmosphere of the crystal ballroom as Major Kellerman found himself facing a woman whose calm demeanor somehow made his aggressive certainty seem increasingly hollow. Rebecca Martinez stood with the kind of stillness that suggested complete self-control rather than nervousness, her dark eyes fixed on his face with an attention that made him suddenly aware of being evaluated rather than simply challenged. "Well," Kellerman began, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of someone who believed his own expertise, "real combat veterans carry themselves differently. There's a certain bearing, a way of moving that comes from actual battlefield experience. They don't need to prove anything because their confidence comes from tested competence." Several officers in the surrounding crowd nodded thoughtfully, recognizing elements of truth in his assessment even as they began to sense something was off about his application of these principles. Rebecca remained motionless, allowing him to continue building his case while her own presence seemed to grow more substantial despite her physical stillness. "They also understand the brotherhood," Kellerman continued, warming to his theme. "Real operators recognize each other. There's an instant connection, a shared understanding that can't be faked. When someone doesn't trigger that recognition, when they seem like an outsider trying to fit in, it's usually because they are." Patricia Hayes stepped slightly closer to Rebecca, her own military bearing evident in the protective positioning. As someone who had worked extensively with classified personnel during her intelligence career, she understood the dangerous game Kellerman was playing. The assumption that quiet service meant fraudulent service was not just wrong, but potentially lethal to operational security. "Major," Patricia interjected with the voice of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "your analysis assumes that all legitimate military service follows conventional patterns. That assumption is both incorrect and potentially harmful." Kellerman's eyes flicked to Patricia, recognizing her authority but clearly resenting the interruption. "Colonel Hayes, with respect, I'm not questioning conventional service. I'm questioning whether certain individuals have the right to present themselves at events intended for genuine combat veterans." The implication was clear and insulting. Rebecca felt the familiar tactical awareness that had once kept her alive in hostile territory beginning to sharpen her focus. She noted exit routes, assessed potential threats, and unconsciously cataloged the positioning of everyone within her immediate vicinity. Old habits from a life spent in environments where miscalculation meant death. "And you've determined that?" "I don't belong here," Rebecca said, her voice maintaining the same quiet tone while somehow carrying more weight. "Based on what specific evidence, Major?" Kellerman gestured toward her appearance with the confidence of someone who believed surface observations told the complete story. "Look at yourself, ma'am. Your posture, your clothing choices, the way you've been standing apart from the military personnel all evening. You carry yourself like a civilian who's uncomfortable around real soldiers." The assessment was so completely wrong that Rebecca almost smiled. Her positioning at the edge of the ballroom wasn't discomfort, but tactical positioning, maintaining sight lines while keeping her back to a wall. Her clothing was chosen for mobility and concealment rather than fashion. Her posture reflected years of training in remaining unnoticed rather than any lack of military bearing. But explaining these choices would require revealing exactly the kind of information that had been classified at levels far above Kellerman's clearance. Instead, she simply nodded acknowledgement of his observation. "Continue," she said simply. The single word somehow managed to sound like a command, despite being delivered as a request. Several nearby officers unconsciously straightened, responding to an authority they couldn't quite identify but instinctively recognized. Kellerman, however, was too committed to his performance to notice the subtle shift in the room's dynamics. "Furthermore," he pressed on, "your entire demeanor suggests someone who learned about military culture secondhand rather than living it. Real veterans don't need to study how to fit in, because military bearing becomes second nature. You look like someone who's been practicing. The irony of his assessment was profound. Rebecca's careful cultivation of unremarkable appearance wasn't amateur hour preparation, but professional-level operational security. She had spent years learning to blend into any environment, to become forgettable rather than memorable, to project whatever persona best served her mission requirements. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a Pentagon analyst who had been listening from nearby, moved closer with the careful steps of someone navigating treacherous social waters. As a civilian who worked regularly with military personnel, she understood the gravity of stolen valor accusations, while also recognizing something unusual about the developing confrontation. Major Kellerman, Dr. Morrison said carefully, these are serious allegations you're making. Perhaps we should consider that there might be aspects of someone's service that aren't immediately apparent. Kellerman turned toward her with barely concealed impatience. Dr. Morrison, I appreciate your diplomatic approach, but sometimes situations require direct assessment. We have a responsibility to call out fraud when we see it, especially at events that honor genuine sacrifice. His words carried the ring of righteousness, the certainty of someone who believed he was defending important principles. But Rebecca recognized something else in his tone, the eagerness of someone who enjoyed the attention that came with making dramatic accusations. This wasn't just about protecting military honor. It was about establishing himself as an authority figure at a gathering of his superiors. And you're certain you see fraud, Rebecca said, the statement delivered without inflection, but somehow managing to sound like a challenge. I'm certain I see someone who doesn't belong at an event honoring combat veterans, Kellerman replied, his voice rising slightly as he sensed the crowd's growing attention. Someone who's trading on false narratives about classified service that can't be verified. The mention of classified service caused a ripple of reaction through the gathered officers. Several exchanged glances that suggested they understood implications Kellerman was missing. In the world of special operations and intelligence work, the most genuine heroes were often those whose achievements could never be publicly acknowledged. Colonel Hayes stepped forward with the measured movement of someone about to deliver a warning. Major, you're making assumptions about classification levels and operational security that may be beyond your expertise. Colonel, with all due respect, I've been briefed on enough classified operations to recognize the difference between legitimate security concerns and convenient excuses for embellishment. The response revealed more about Kellerman's actual level of security clearance than he probably intended. Rebecca filed the information automatically, her analytical mind continuing to assess the situation even as she maintained her outwardly calm demeanor. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, who had been observing the confrontation with growing concern, approached the group with the decisive movement of someone about to intervene. As the evening's protocol officer, she had a responsibility to prevent social situations from escalating into incidents that could embarrass the military leadership present. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting, she suggested diplomatically, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing delicate situations. But Kellerman was too committed to his public performance to accept graceful withdrawal. The attention of the ballroom's elite was focused on him, creating exactly the kind of spotlight he had been seeking throughout his career. Lieutenant Colonel Chun, I appreciate the concern, but sometimes truth needs to be spoken publicly. We have too many people trading on stolen valor, claiming classified service they never performed, diminishing the real sacrifices made by genuine warriors. His voice had risen enough to carry across a wider area of the ballroom, drawing additional attention from guests who had been engaged in their own conversations. Rebecca was aware of more eyes turning toward their group, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle she had spent her career learning to avoid. The situation was approaching a decision point, where she would either need to withdraw completely or stand her ground in ways that might compromise the anonymity she had carefully maintained. Neither option was particularly appealing, but Kellerman's escalating accusations were beginning to cross lines that went beyond personal insult into territory that could affect other veterans who had served in similar circumstances. "Major Kellerman," she said, her voice still quiet but now carrying an edge that made several nearby officers unconsciously take a step back. "You seem very invested in proving that I don't belong here. Perhaps you should consider why that matters so much to you." The response was delivered with surgical precision, targeting the psychological motivation behind his accusations rather than defending against them. It was the kind of verbal maneuvering that came from years of interrogation training and psychological operations experience. Kellerman's face flushed as he recognized the subtle attack on his motivations. "Man, this isn't personal. This is about integrity and the honor of the uniform." "No," Rebecca replied, taking a single step forward that somehow managed to close the distance between them while making her appear more substantial rather than aggressive. "This is about your need to establish dominance in a room full of people who outrank you by demonstrating superior judgment about things you don't understand." The analysis was delivered with clinical detachment, but its accuracy hit Kellerman like a physical blow. Several officers in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the truth in her assessment while wondering how a supposed civilian had developed such precise insight into military psychology. Kellerman's confident expression wavered for the first time as Rebecca's precise psychological assessment hit its mark. The flush spreading across his face revealed someone who had been exposed rather than someone defending principle, and the shift in his demeanor was noticed by the growing circle of observers surrounding their confrontation. "You don't know anything about me or my motivations," he said, his voice taking on a defensive edge that undermined the authority he had been projecting moments earlier. "I'm simply pointing out inconsistencies that any experienced officer would notice." Rebecca remained perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on his face with the kind of attention that made him increasingly uncomfortable. She had learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than any verbal response, forcing opponents to fill the void with statements that revealed more than they intended. "For instance," Kellerman continued, his need to justify himself overriding tactical wisdom, "you claim to be a veteran, but you don't display any of the automatic responses that come from actual military service. Real soldiers recognize each other instinctively." Captain James Rodriguez, a Special Forces officer who had been quietly observing the exchange, moved closer with the measured steps of someone who sensed dangerous undercurrents. His own experience with classified operations had taught him to recognize the signs of someone operating under deep cover, and something about Rebecca's controlled responses was triggering his professional instincts. "Major," Rodriguez said carefully, "perhaps we should consider that not all military service follows conventional patterns. Some of the most dedicated personnel operate in ways that require them to suppress obvious military bearing." Kellerman turned toward Rodriguez with visible irritation. "Captain, I've worked with special operations personnel. I know how real operators conduct themselves. This woman doesn't fit any profile I've encountered." The statement revealed more about the limitations of Kellerman's experience than he realized. Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful glance with Colonel Hayes, both recognizing that Kellerman's clearance level and operational exposure were clearly insufficient for him to understand the full spectrum of military service. "Major Kellerman," Rebecca said quietly, "you keep mentioning profiles and patterns. Tell me, what's your assessment of my specific background based on these observations?" The question was delivered with the same neutral tone, but there was something underneath it that made several experienced officers in the crowd unconsciously straighten. It sounded like the kind of query that preceded either education or demolition, depending on the wisdom of the response. Kellerman, however, was too committed to his public performance to recognize the warning. Based on your demeanor, your civilian appearance, and your obvious discomfort with military protocol, I'd assess you as someone who served in a support role, probably stateside, who's inflated that service into something more significant for social advantage. The accusation hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. Rebecca absorbed the insult without visible reaction, though several observers noted that her already perfect posture somehow became even more controlled. The stillness that had characterized her presence throughout the evening was beginning to feel less like nervousness and more like the calm that preceded decisive action. Dr. Morrison, who had been watching the exchange with growing concern about its potential consequences, stepped forward with the diplomatic instincts of someone who spent her career managing volatile situations. "Major, these are very specific allegations. Perhaps we should consider whether this is the appropriate venue for such accusations." Dr. Morrison, stolen valor is a serious crime that dishonors every genuine veteran in this room, Kellerman replied, his voice carrying the righteousness of someone who believed he was defending sacred principles. "If we don't call it out when we see it, we become complicit in the deception." Brigadier General Kenneth Walsh, who had been engaged in conversation across the room, began moving toward the disturbance with the measured pace of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. His presence was noted by several junior officers, who automatically began creating space for his approach. "The problem," Kellerman continued, emboldened by what he interpreted as validation from the crowd's attention, "is that we've created an environment where people feel entitled to claim military honor they didn't earn. Support personnel present themselves as combat veterans. Desk jockeys claim special operations experience. It's an epidemic that needs to be addressed." Rebecca listened to his expanding accusations with the same impassive attention, but those closest to her began to notice subtle changes in her presence. Her breathing had become deeper and more controlled. Her eyes, which had appeared soft and unremarkable throughout the evening, now seemed to be cataloging everything and everyone within her field of view. "Major," she said finally, her voice still quiet but now carrying undertones that made experienced officers unconsciously check their own postures, "you seem very confident in your ability to identify fraud. How exactly do you distinguish between legitimate classified service and convenient excuses?" The question was delivered with surgical precision, targeting the weakest point in Kellerman's argument while revealing sophisticated understanding of operational security principles. It was the kind of query that came from someone who understood classification systems from the inside rather than theoretical knowledge. Kellerman hesitated for the first time, recognizing that he was being led into territory where his expertise might be insufficient. Legitimate classified operations leave traces that can be verified through proper channels. People with genuine special operations backgrounds can be confirmed through their chain of command, even if specific details remain classified. "And you've conducted such verification regarding my service?" The simple question exposed the fundamental flaw in his accusations. Kellerman had made sweeping judgments based entirely on surface observations, without any actual investigation of Rebecca's background. His certainty was built on assumption rather than evidence. "Ma'am, I don't need to verify what's obvious from observation. Your entire presentation screams civilian contractor or support personnel trying to pass as something more significant." Colonel Hayes stepped forward with the crisp movement of someone who had reached the limit of her patience. "Major Kellerman, you're making accusations that go far beyond your authority or expertise. I suggest you reconsider your approach." "But—" Kellerman was too invested in his public stance to retreat gracefully. The attention of the ballroom's elite was focused on him, creating exactly the kind of recognition he had been seeking throughout his career. Backing down now would undermine not just this confrontation, but his broader reputation for decisive judgment. "Colonel Hayes, with respect, someone needs to have the courage to call out these situations. We owe it to genuine veterans to protect the integrity of their service. Lieutenant Colonel Chun approached the group with increased urgency, her responsibility for the evening's protocol making her acutely aware of how quickly the situation was deteriorating. Major, perhaps we could continue this discussion in a more private setting where all parties could address these concerns appropriately. Lieutenant Colonel, I appreciate the diplomatic approach, but fraud thrives in privacy. Sometimes truth needs to be spoken publicly, regardless of social comfort. His words carried across an increasingly wide area of the ballroom, as conversations continued to pause and attention focused on the developing confrontation. Rebecca was aware of more eyes turning toward their group, creating exactly the kind of public spectacle that her training had taught her to avoid at all costs. The situation had reached a critical decision point where continued silence might be interpreted as validation of Kellerman's accusations, potentially affecting not just her own reputation, but the broader veteran community he was attacking. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 5 years was being systematically destroyed by someone whose arrogance exceeded his wisdom. Major Kellerman, she said, her voice still controlled but now carrying an authority that made several nearby officers unconsciously come to attention. You've made your assessment clear. Perhaps you should consider the possibility that your observations might be incomplete. The subtle shift in Rebecca's tone caused a ripple of recognition among the more experienced officers in the crowd, though none could immediately identify what had changed. Her voice carried the same quiet cadence, but there was now an undertone of command authority that suggested depths Kellerman had failed to perceive. What the assembled guests didn't know was that Rebecca Martinez had never truly been Rebecca Martinez at all. The woman standing before them, in a simple black dress and practical shoes, was Captain Alexandra Santos, whose classified service record contained operations that existed only in the most restricted databases of American intelligence agencies. For 15 years, she had operated under deep cover in environments where discovery meant not just mission failure but certain death. The persona of Rebecca Martinez had been carefully constructed as part of a witness protection program for former intelligence operatives whose covers had been compromised during the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. 3 separate terrorist organizations had placed bounties on Captain Santos's head after her role in dismantling their networks became known through captured documents. The quiet nonprofit worker was not just a career change, but a lifeline that allowed her to remain in the United States rather than disappearing into permanent exile. Her actual military record, buried under classification levels that required presidential authorization to access, detailed operations across 4 continents and 7 countries. As Phantom 6, she had led hostage rescues in Somalia, coordinated resistance networks in Syria, and penetrated terrorist cells in Yemen. Her linguistic abilities included fluent Arabic, Farsi, and Pashto, while her operational skills encompassed everything from advanced combat techniques to psychological warfare. The irony of Kellerman's accusations was profound. He was attacking someone whose service record made his own conventional deployment to Afghanistan look like a training exercise. But those achievements existed in a world of absolute secrecy, protected by classification systems designed to ensure that operators like Captain Santos could continue their work without compromise. Her transition to civilian life had been managed through a joint program between the CIA and Department of Defense that provided new identities for operatives whose covers had been blown. The Rebecca Martinez identity included a complete fabricated history, birth certificate from Albuquerque, college transcripts from the University of New Mexico, and military service records showing 8 years as a communications specialist with an honorable discharge for family hardship. Even her physical appearance had been subtly altered through minor cosmetic procedures that changed her facial structure enough to defeat most recognition systems while maintaining her natural appearance. The graying hair was artificial, designed to age her appearance by several years and provide additional camouflage against anyone who might remember the younger Captain Santos. The non-profit work wasn't random either, but carefully chosen to utilize her genuine skills while maintaining operational security. Her ability to help veterans transition to civilian careers drew on real experience with cover identity creation and cultural adaptation. Her understanding of PTSD and combat stress came from both personal experience and extensive training in psychological operations. Colonel Hayes was one of only 3 people at the gathering who knew Rebecca's true identity, having served as her handler during the transition process. Patricia's own intelligence background had made her the ideal supervisor for an operative learning to navigate civilian life while maintaining the deep cover that kept her alive. The encrypted chip in Rebecca's necklace contained emergency contact information for extraction team that could remove her from any compromised situation within 6 hours. It also included identity documents for 3 different backup personas and financial resources sufficient to disappear completely if her current cover was blown. She touched the chain unconsciously, a gesture that appeared nervous but was actually confirming the device remained functional. Her modest apartment in Arlington contained hidden compartments with weapons, communication equipment, and survival gear that would allow her to operate independently for extended periods. The simple Honda Civic in her parking space had been modified with enhanced engine performance, bulletproof glass, and run-flat tires. Even her civilian wardrobe was chosen to provide concealment for weapons and equipment while maintaining her unremarkable appearance. The psychological pressure of maintaining deep cover for 5 years had been enormous. Every interaction required careful attention to her fabricated background. Every relationship had to be managed to prevent emotional attachments that could compromise operational security. The loneliness was constant and absolute, relieved only by her work with veterans who needed help transitioning to lives that, while difficult, were still far more normal than her own existence. Dr. Morrison, observing the confrontation with growing unease, began to recognize signs that suggested the situation was more complex than it appeared. Rebecca's controlled responses and tactical awareness were inconsistent with someone who had served in a support role, while her obvious familiarity with operational security suggested experience that went far beyond communication specialist duties. Captain Rodriguez, whose own special operations background had taught him to recognize fellow professionals, was beginning to suspect that Kellerman had chosen the wrong target for his accusations. Something about Rebecca's bearing and responses suggested training that went far beyond conventional military service, though he couldn't identify specific indicators that would reveal her true background. The tragic irony was that Rebecca had been looking forward to the evening as a rare opportunity to interact with military personnel without the need for complete deception. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Gala was one of the few social settings where her fabricated military background allowed her to share genuine experiences and emotions without compromising her cover. Kellerman's accusations were not just personally insulting, but threatened to destroy one of her few connections to the community she had served. Brigadier General Walsh continued his approach toward the developing confrontation, his experienced eye recognizing the signs of a situation that was spiraling beyond social awkwardness into something that could have serious consequences. His own intelligence background had taught him to recognize when classified matters were being discussed in inappropriate settings. The weight of maintaining her false identity while enduring public accusations of fraud was beginning to test even Rebecca's legendary self-control. Every instinct developed through years of dangerous operations was telling her to end the confrontation decisively, but doing so would require revealing exactly the kind of capabilities that would compromise her carefully maintained cover. Assembled crowd was beginning to sense that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement about military service. The tension in the air had moved beyond social discomfort into something that felt potentially explosive. Though most guests couldn't identify the source of their growing unease, the moment of reckoning arrived with the distinctive sound of shattering crystal as a server's tray of champagne glasses crashed to the marble floor behind the crowd, the sharp noise cutting through the ballroom's tension like a gunshot. In the split second of startled silence that followed, every person in the immediate area turned toward the disturbance except Rebecca, whose head remained fixed on Kellerman while her eyes tracked the movement of everyone around her with the automatic threat assessment of someone whose survival had once depended on such awareness. The unconscious display of tactical alertness was noted by Captain Rodriguez, who felt a chill of recognition as he observed Rebecca's response. No civilian, regardless of their fabricated military background, would maintain visual contact with a potential threat while simultaneously cataloging the positions and reactions of everyone in their vicinity. It was a combat reflex that could only be developed through genuine operational experience in hostile environments. Kellerman, oblivious to the significance of what Rodriguez had observed, seized the moment of disruption to press his advantage. "You see?" he said, gesturing toward Rebecca's controlled reaction. "Even her response to an unexpected noise is wrong. Real combat veterans develop hypervigilance that makes them immediately assess potential threats. She barely reacted at all." The assessment was so fundamentally incorrect that several experienced officers exchanged meaningful glances. Kellerman had observed Rebecca's textbook threat evaluation but completely misinterpreted its significance, revealing the limitations of his own operational exposure while inadvertently providing evidence that supported the opposite of his conclusion. Dr. Morrison stepped forward with the careful precision of someone navigating increasingly dangerous waters. Her work with classified programs had taught her to recognize when conversations were approaching topics that could compromise national security, and something about the developing confrontation was triggering her professional instincts. "Major Kellerman," she said diplomatically, "perhaps we should consider that different types of military service produce different behavioral patterns. Not all veterans respond to stress in identical ways." Dr. Morrison respectfully, "I've studied combat psychology extensively during my deployment preparation. There are established patterns that distinguish genuine combat experience from fabricated claims." Rebecca listened to his confident assertions with the patience of someone who had spent years allowing others to underestimate her capabilities. The irony was that Kellerman's theoretical knowledge was actually quite accurate in general terms, but his application was being undermined by his failure to recognize advanced training that went far beyond conventional combat experience. Brigadier General Walsh reached the edge of the crowd, his presence immediately noted by the junior officers who began creating space for his approach. His weathered face showed the concern of someone who understood that public confrontations involving accusations of military fraud could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate social embarrassment. "What seems to be the issue here?" Walsh asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to diffusing volatile situations before they escalated beyond control. Lieutenant Colonel Chun immediately stepped forward, recognizing her responsibility to brief the general on the developing crisis. "Sir, there appears to be a disagreement regarding military service records and appropriate recognition for veteran contributions." The carefully diplomatic language was designed to minimize the explosive nature of what was actually occurring, but Walsh's experienced eye quickly assessed the body language and positioning of the principals involved. Rebecca's controlled stillness and Kellerman's aggressive posturing told a story that went beyond simple disagreement. "Major Kellerman," Walsh said, directing his attention to the officer whose uniform and bearing marked him as the likely source of the confrontation, "would you care to explain your concerns?" Kellerman straightened to attention, clearly pleased to have the opportunity to present his case to someone of Walsh's stature. "Sir, I believe we have an individual present who may be misrepresenting her military service in ways that dishonor Genuine veterans. If you enjoyed this video, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. The accusation, delivered in formal military language to a general officer, transformed what had been a social confrontation into something approaching an official complaint. Walsh's expression grew more serious as he recognized the potential implications of such charges being made publicly at a high-profile military event. "That's a serious allegation, Major. On what evidence do you base this assessment?" "Sir, based on behavioral analysis, appearance inconsistencies, and responses that don't align with genuine military experience, I believe this individual is engaging in stolen valor." Walsh's eyes moved to Rebecca, taking in her composed demeanor and the subtle signs of tension that marked her as someone operating under significant stress. His own intelligence background had taught him to recognize when situations involved more complexity than was immediately apparent. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Rebecca directly, "how do you respond to these allegations?" Rebecca faced a decision point that would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation but potentially the future of her carefully constructed civilian identity. Responding to formal accusations made to a general officer would require either accepting the charges or providing information that could compromise her operational security. "General Walsh," she said, her voice maintaining the same controlled tone while somehow conveying respect for his rank, "I believe Major Kellerman has made assumptions about my background that reflect limitations in his understanding rather than accuracy in his assessment." The response was perfectly calibrated to neither confirm nor deny his specific charges while suggesting that his conclusions were based on insufficient information. It was the kind of verbal maneuvering that came from years of debriefings and interrogation training. "Major," Walsh continued, "have you conducted any formal verification of this individual's service record through appropriate channels?" Kellerman hesitated, recognizing that he was being asked to provide evidence rather than opinion. "Sir, I based my assessment on observable indicators that suggest inconsistencies with genuine military experience." "I see, and these observable indicators include what specific elements?" The general's questioning was taking on the systematic approach of someone conducting an official inquiry, creating a dynamic that was rapidly moving beyond social confrontation into territory that could have formal consequences for all involved parties. "Sir, her demeanor, her positioning at social gatherings, her responses to military protocol, and her overall presentation suggest someone who learned about military culture secondhand rather than through direct experience." Walsh absorbed this information while continuing to assess Rebecca's controlled reactions. Something about her bearing was triggering recognition patterns that suggested familiarity with high-level operational environments, though he couldn't immediately identify the specific source of that impression. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to Rebecca, "would you be willing to provide clarification regarding your military service to resolve this matter?" The question was delivered with the courtesy due to a civilian guest, but its implications were clear. Refusing to respond would effectively validate Kellerman's accusations, while providing details could compromise the classification systems that protected her identity. Rebecca felt the walls of her carefully constructed anonymity beginning to collapse around her as the confrontation moved beyond social awkwardness into formal territory that would require documentation and verification. The 5 years of peaceful civilian existence were being systematically destroyed by someone whose arrogance had led him to challenge exactly the wrong person. "General," she said carefully, "I believe there are aspects of this situation that may be more complex than they appear." General Walsh's experienced eyes narrowed slightly as he processed Rebecca's carefully worded response, recognizing the diplomatic language of someone who understood the intricacies of classified information protocols. His own decades of service in intelligence operations had taught him to identify when conversations were approaching sensitive territory that required careful navigation. "Ma'am," he said with measured formality. Complexity often accompanies legitimate concerns. Perhaps you could help us understand what aspects of your service might clarify Major Kellerman's observations. The question was delivered with the precision of someone who understood that he might be dealing with classification issues beyond the scope of a social gathering. Rebecca felt the familiar tension of operational decision-making as she weighed her limited options, each carrying potential consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate confrontation. Before she could respond, Kellerman stepped forward. With renewed confidence, interpreting the general's systematic questioning as validation of his accusations. "Sir, this is exactly the pattern I was describing. When pressed for specific details, individuals engaging in stolen valor typically claim their service is too classified to discuss." "Major," Walsh replied with a tone that carried warning undertones, "you're making assumptions about classification protocols that may exceed your clearance level. I suggest you allow this conversation to proceed without additional commentary." The rebuke was delivered with military courtesy, but its message was unmistakable. Kellerman's face flushed as he recognized that his eagerness to press his case was beginning to work against him, though he seemed unable to grasp the broader implications of what was developing. Colonel Hayes moved closer to Rebecca's position, her own intelligence background making her acutely aware of the dangerous territory the conversation was entering. As one of the few people present who understood Rebecca's true situation, she could see the impossible position her friend was being forced into by Kellerman's persistence. "General Walsh," Patricia said carefully, "perhaps this matter would be better addressed through appropriate channels rather than in a public forum. Some service records require verification procedures that aren't suitable for social settings." Her intervention was designed to provide Rebecca with an escape route that would preserve operational security while avoiding the public humiliation of appearing to validate stolen valor accusations. But Walsh's systematic approach suggested he understood there were stakes involved beyond simple social embarrassment. Dr. Morrison, observing the increasingly formal tone of the exchanges, began to recognize that she was witnessing something that transcended typical military protocol. Disputes. The careful language being used by all parties suggested underlying issues that involved classification levels and security concerns beyond her clearance. "Perhaps," she offered diplomatically, "we could arrange for private verification that would satisfy all parties without compromising any sensitive information that might be involved." Kellerman turned toward her with visible frustration, clearly sensing that his public confrontation was being redirected into channels that would deny him the validation he sought. "Dr. Morrison, with respect, stolen valor thrives when we allow it to hide behind claims of classification. Real veterans with legitimate classified service can still verify their basic military background." Captain Rodriguez stepped forward with the controlled movement of someone who had reached a decision point. His own special operations experience had provided him with enough exposure to deep cover operations to recognize the signs of someone operating under assumed identity for security purposes. "Major Kellerman," he said quietly, "you may want to consider that your understanding of classification protocols might be insufficient for the situation you're addressing." The warning was delivered with the authority of someone who had operated at classification levels that exceeded conventional military experience, but Kellerman was too committed to his public stance to recognize the expertise behind Rodriguez's caution. "Captain, I appreciate your concern, but we can't allow fear of classification to prevent us from addressing obvious fraud. The integrity of military service depends on our willingness to challenge false claims." His words carried across an increasingly wide area of the ballroom as more guests became aware of the developing confrontation. Rebecca noted the growing attention with professional alarm, recognizing that her cover identity was being systematically compromised in exactly the kind of public forum that could attract unwanted scrutiny from hostile intelligence services. "Brigadier General Thompson," the evening's guest of honor, had been engaged in conversation with Pentagon officials across the room when the disturbance began to draw his attention. His aide, Major Lisa Winters, approached him with the concerned expression of someone who understood that high-profile military events could be damaged by the wrong kind of publicity. "Sir," she said quietly, "there appears to be a situation developing that might require your intervention. Someone is making public accusations regarding military service fraud." Thompson's weathered face showed immediate concern as he recognized the potential implications. Stolen valor accusations at a Veterans of Foreign Wars gala could generate exactly the kind of negative media attention that would overshadow the evening's legitimate purpose of honoring genuine military service. "Brief me on the specifics," he ordered, already moving toward the disturbance with the decisive pace of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. Meanwhile, Rebecca faced an increasingly desperate situation as the formal nature of the confrontation made it impossible to simply withdraw without appearing to validate Kellerman's accusations. Her training had prepared her for countless scenarios involving hostile interrogation and operational compromise, but none had involved defending her cover identity against stolen valor charges in a ballroom full of military elite. The encrypted communication device in her necklace contained emergency protocols that could extract her from compromised situations, but using them would require abandoning not just the evening but her entire civilian identity. 5 years of careful reconstruction would be lost, forcing her back into the shadows of denied operations and permanent exile from normal life. Colonel Hayes, recognizing her friend's impossible position, made a decision that would risk her own career to protect Rebecca's operational security. "General Walsh," she said, with the authority of someone prepared to stake her reputation on her words, "I believe this situation involves classification issues that require immediate private consultation." The intervention was delivered with enough emphasis to suggest that national security concerns were involved, creating an obligation for Walsh to remove the matter from public scrutiny, regardless of his personal curiosity about the developing confrontation. "Major Kellerman," Walsh said with finality, "this matter will be addressed through appropriate channels. I suggest you consider whether continuing this public confrontation serves the best interests of military professionalism." But Kellerman, sensing that his opportunity for vindication was being systematically dismantled by higher-ranking officers, made the decision that would transform the evening from social embarrassment into operational crisis. "Sir, with all due respect, I believe we have a responsibility to address fraud when we see it, regardless of claims about classification. This individual has been presenting herself as a veteran at events intended for genuine military personnel, and allowing that to continue dishonors everyone who served legitimately." His voice carried across the ballroom with enough volume to attract the attention of General Thompson, who was approaching with the measured pace of someone about to take command of a deteriorating situation. The evening's guest of honor had dealt with enough classification issues during his own career to recognize when conversations were approaching dangerous territory. The moment of ultimate crisis was approaching as Rebecca realized that her carefully maintained cover was about to be destroyed by someone whose ignorance exceeded his authority, forcing her to choose between maintaining operational security and defending against accusations that could destroy her reputation within the veteran community she had served with such distinction. General Thompson's arrival at the confrontation created an immediate shift in the ballroom's atmosphere as conversations throughout the surrounding area began to quiet in deference to the evening's guest of honor. His 4-star rank and reputation as one of the military's most respected leaders commanded automatic attention from everyone within sight, transforming what had been a localized dispute into something approaching an official inquiry. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as she recognized Thompson's approach, not from nervousness but from the tactical awareness that her situation had just become exponentially more dangerous. The general's presence meant that whatever resolution emerged from this Confrontation would carry weight far beyond the immediate social embarrassment, potentially affecting classification systems and operational security protocols that protected numerous other operatives. "General Thompson," Walsh said, with the formal courtesy due to a superior officer, "we have a situation here that may require your guidance. There are allegations being made regarding military service authenticity that involve potential classification concerns." Thompson's weathered face remained impassive as he assessed the principles involved, his experienced eye taking in Rebecca's controlled tension and Kellerman's aggressive posturing. Decades of command experience had taught him to recognize when disputes involved more complexity than their surface appearance suggested. "Major Kellerman," he said, addressing the obvious source of the confrontation, "explain your concerns." Kellerman came to rigid attention, clearly overwhelmed by the opportunity to present his case directly to one of the military's most senior leaders. "Sir, I believe we have an individual present who is misrepresenting her military service, claiming experiences she never had and dishonoring the sacrifice of genuine veterans. And these allegations are based on what specific evidence?" The question was delivered with the systematic precision of someone who had conducted countless investigations during his career. Thompson's tone suggested he was prepared to evaluate claims based on facts rather than assumptions, creating pressure for Kellerman to provide substantive proof rather than observational speculation. "Sir, based on behavioral analysis, response patterns, and presentation inconsistencies, this individual displays none of the characteristics associated with genuine military service, particularly combat operations or classified assignments." Rebecca listened to the familiar accusations with growing resignation as she realized that her carefully constructed civilian life was being systematically dismantled by someone whose confidence far exceeded his competence. The irony that she was being accused of stolen valor by someone whose own military experience paled in comparison to her classified achievements was almost overwhelming. Thompson's attention shifted to Rebecca, his assessment more thorough and professional than the casual observations that had characterized Kellerman's approach. Something about her barren and controlled responses was triggering recognition patterns that suggested familiarity with high-level operational environments. "Ma'am," he said with the courtesy appropriate for a civilian guest while maintaining the authority of his rank, "how do you respond to these allegations?" The question represented the moment Rebecca had been dreading since the confrontation began. Responding honestly would require revealing information that could compromise operational security, affecting numerous other personnel, while maintaining her cover story would mean accepting public humiliation and potential criminal charges before she could formulate a response. The situation took an unexpected turn that would change everything. From across the ballroom, a voice called out with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in hostile environments. "Phantom 6, front and center." The words cut through the crowd's murmur like a blade, causing Rebecca to freeze in recognition while every person within hearing distance turned to identify the speaker. The call sign that had been buried under layers of classification for 5 years had just been broadcast in the most public possible forum. Colonel Marcus Steele emerged from the crowd with the measured pace of someone who had just made a decision that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate confrontation. His own distinguished career in special operations had included enough exposure to deep cover personnel to recognize when classification protocols needed to be sacrificed to prevent greater damage. Rebecca's carefully maintained composure cracked for the first time as she recognized Steele, a former commander who had coordinated several of her most dangerous missions during her operational years. His presence at the gala meant that her cover had been compromised at levels she hadn't anticipated, creating vulnerabilities that extended far beyond Kellerman's accusations. "Colonel Steele," she responded automatically, her voice taking on the crisp military tone that had been suppressed for 5 years of civilian life. The response was delivered with the immediate obedience that had once characterized her interactions with operational commanders, revealing behavioral patterns that contradicted everything Kellerman had observed about her demeanor. The exchange sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd as the military personnel present recognized the implications of what they had just witnessed. Classified call signs weren't used casually in social settings, and the automatic response Rebecca had displayed suggested training and experience that went far beyond conventional military service. Kellerman's confident expression collapsed as he began to understand that his accusations had just been demolished by evidence he couldn't challenge or dismiss. The woman he had dismissed as a fraud had just been publicly identified by a senior special operations officer, using terminology that indicated the highest levels of classified service. General Thompson's demeanor shifted from judicial evaluation to operational alertness as he recognized that the confrontation had moved beyond stolen valor allegations into territory involving active classification protocols. His own experience with special operations personnel had taught him to recognize when cover identities were being compromised in ways that could have national security implications. "Colonel Steele," Thompson said with measured authority, "perhaps you could clarify the situation for those of us who may not fully understand the context of your identification." Steele's weathered face showed the grim determination of someone who had decided that operational security concerns were outweighed by the need to prevent an injustice that could have broader consequences for the special operations community. "Sir, the individual Major Kellerman has been accusing of stolen valor is Captain Alexandra Santos, one of the most decorated covert operatives in recent military history. Her service record includes operations that remain classified at levels requiring presidential authorization to access." The revelation hit the ballroom like a physical force, creating a silence so complete that the distant sound of traffic from the street below became audible. Rebecca felt the last vestiges of her carefully constructed civilian identity evaporating as her true background was exposed in exactly the kind of public forum that could compromise not just her own safety, but the security of ongoing operations worldwide. Dr. Morrison stepped backward involuntarily, her understanding of classification protocols making her acutely aware that she was witnessing the destruction of cover identities that represented years of careful construction and enormous financial investment by intelligence agencies. Captain Rodriguez felt a chill of recognition as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place, his own special operations background providing enough context to understand the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The behavioral patterns he had noticed throughout the evening suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of deep cover operational training. Colonel Hayes closed her eyes briefly in resignation, knowing that her friend's peaceful civilian existence had just been destroyed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The 5 years of careful anonymity that had allowed Rebecca to build something approaching a normal life were gone, sacrificed to prevent the injustice of stolen valor accusations against someone who had served with extraordinary distinction. Kellerman stood frozen in horror as the implications of his accusations became clear, recognizing that he had just publicly attacked someone whose service record made his own conventional deployment look insignificant by comparison. The confidence that had driven his confrontational approach was rapidly being replaced by the understanding that he had made an error, with consequences extending far beyond social embarrassment. General Thompson faced a crisis management situation that would require immediate action to contain the security breach while addressing the human cost of the exposure. The evening that had been intended to honor military service had just become a case study in the complex intersection of operational security and public recognition. The silence that followed Colonel Steele's revelation stretched across the crystal ballroom like a held breath, broken only by the distant sounds of Washington traffic filtering through the hotel's windows. Rebecca stood motionless in the center of what had become an impromptu circle of military elite, her cover identity stripped away as completely as if she had been physically exposed before the assembled crowd. General Thompson's expression had shifted from judicial inquiry to crisis management as he recognized the full implications of what had just occurred. The public exposure of a deep cover operative's true identity represented not just a security breach but a potential intelligence catastrophe that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger personnel worldwide. Colonel Steele, Thompson said with carefully controlled authority, "I believe this conversation needs to continue in a more secure environment. Major Winters, please coordinate with hotel security to establish a controlled perimeter around this area." The order was delivered with the calm precision of someone who had managed countless crisis situations. But Rebecca could see the concern in Thompson's eyes as he began to assess the damage that had already been done. Her operational identity had been exposed to dozens of civilian guests and foreign nationals whose loyalty and discretion could not be guaranteed. Major Kellerman remained frozen in position, his face showing the horror of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. The woman he had accused of stolen valor had just been revealed as someone whose service record contained achievements that dwarfed his own conventional military experience by orders of magnitude. "Sir," he said with a voice that had lost all its earlier confidence, "I had no idea. I was simply trying to protect the integrity of military service." "Major," Thompson replied with icy formality, "your good intentions do not mitigate the consequences of your actions. You will remain available for immediate debriefing once we assess the full scope of this security breach." The rebuke was delivered with enough force to make several nearby officers wince in sympathy, recognizing that Kellerman's career had just been effectively ended by his own arrogance and poor judgment. The military did not forgive officers who compromised operational security through reckless accusations. Rebecca felt the familiar calm of operational crisis settling over her consciousness as her training reasserted itself in response to the exposure. The persona of Rebecca Martinez was gone, replaced by the tactical decision-making and threat assessment capabilities that had once made Captain Alexandra Santos one of the most effective operatives in the field. "General Thompson," she said, her voice now carrying the crisp authority that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous environments on Earth, "we need to assess immediate security implications. This exposure compromises not just my identity, but potentially dozens of other operatives who used similar cover protocols." The transformation in her demeanor was noted by everyone present, as the quiet civilian who had been standing defensively moments earlier was replaced by someone who radiated professional competence and command presence. It was like watching a master actor drop their performance to reveal their true nature. Dr. Morrison stepped further back from the group, her understanding of classification systems making her aware that she was witnessing events that would require extensive damage assessment and potential congressional briefing. The casual social gathering had become an intelligence incident with ramifications that could extend to the highest levels of government. Colonel Hayes moved closer to Rebecca's position, her own intelligence background making her acutely aware of the psychological trauma that accompanied cover identity exposure. The loss of a carefully constructed civilian life was often more devastating than physical injury for operatives who had invested years in building normal relationships and routines. "Alexandra," she said quietly, using Rebecca's true name for the first time in 5 years, "what support do you need right now?" The question was asked with the concern of someone who understood both the immediate security implications and the personal cost of what had just occurred. Rebecca's peaceful existence as a non-profit worker was over, replaced by the need for immediate extraction and the probability of permanent exile from normal civilian life. "Perimeter security first," Rebecca replied with automatic precision. "Then assessment of who was present during the exposure and their potential security risks." We'll need to assume hostile intelligence services will attempt to exploit this breach within hours. Her response demonstrated the kind of operational thinking that had once made her invaluable in hostile environments, but it also revealed the personal cost of the exposure. She was already transitioning from thinking about her civilian life to planning for survival in a world where her true identity was known to potentially hostile forces. Captain Rodriguez approached with the controlled movement of someone who recognized he was in the presence of a legend from the special operations community. His own experience had included enough exposure to classified personnel to understand the magnitude of what Rebecca had achieved during her operational years. "Captain Santos," he said with genuine respect, "if there's anything the special operations community can do to support you through this transition, you have our full backing." The offer was made with the sincerity of someone who understood that Rebecca's service had paved the way for countless other operators, and that her sacrifice deserved recognition even if it couldn't be publicly acknowledged. Brigadier General Walsh stepped forward with the measured pace of someone who had reached a command decision about how to manage the developing crisis. His own intelligence background had provided enough experience with cover identity exposures to understand the protocols that would need to be implemented immediately. "Captain Santos," he said formally, "I'm authorizing immediate protective custody. While we assess the security implications of this exposure, we need to assume that hostile intelligence services may attempt to exploit your compromised status." The order was delivered with the authority of someone who understood that Rebecca's safety was now a matter of national security concern. But it also represented the end of her civilian freedom and the beginning of a new phase of hidden existence under government protection. Rebecca nodded once in acknowledgement of the order, her operational training overriding any personal feelings about the loss of her civilian life. "Understood, sir. I recommend coordinating with the protective detail that's been monitoring this event. They'll have established protocols for this contingency." Her response revealed that she had been aware of security measures that most of the guests hadn't noticed, demonstrating the kind of situational awareness that never truly disappeared regardless of cover identity requirements. Lieutenant Colonel Chen approached with obvious concern about the broader implications for the evening's event and the Veterans of Foreign Wars Foundation that had sponsored it. The exposure of a classified operative at their gala would require extensive coordination with multiple agencies to prevent negative publicity and security complications. "General Thompson," she said carefully, "how do we manage the public relations aspects of this situation? We have civilian guests and media representatives who may not understand the sensitivity of what they've witnessed." The question highlighted one of the most challenging aspects of the crisis: balancing operational security requirements with the need to prevent the incident from generating unwanted attention from hostile intelligence services who monitored such events for exactly these kinds of opportunities. Thompson's weathered face showed the strain of someone who was beginning to understand the full complexity of the situation he was managing. The simple stolen valor accusation had evolved into an intelligence crisis that would require coordination at the highest levels of government. "We'll need immediate coordination with CIA and NSA to assess the full scope of potential compromise," he said grimly. "This may require presidential briefing, depending on what operations have been affected." The gravity in his voice made it clear that the evening's events had moved far beyond military discipline into territory that could affect national security at the strategic level, with consequences that would be measured in terms of intelligence. Assets lost and operations compromised rather than simple career embarrassment. The transformation of the Crystal Ballroom from elegant social gathering to improvised secure facility happened with the swift efficiency that characterized military crisis response. Within minutes of General Thompson's orders, hotel security personnel had established discreet perimeters, while military police officers in civilian dress began identifying and cataloging everyone who had witnessed the exposure of Rebecca's true identity. Major Winters coordinated the security response with the practiced competence of someone who had managed countless sensitive situations during her career as a senior aide. Her earpiece crackled with updates from various security teams as she worked to contain a situation that was rapidly expanding beyond the ballroom's physical boundaries. "Sir," she reported to General Thompson, "we have 43 individuals within the immediate exposure radius, including 12 foreign nationals with diplomatic status and 6 civilian contractors with varying security clearances." The hotel's security cameras captured portions of the incident and were working to secure all recordings. Thompson absorbed this information with the grim expression of someone who understood that each additional witness represented another vector for intelligence compromise. The elegant evening designed to honor military service had become a security nightmare that would require extensive damage control at the highest levels of government. Rebecca stood in the center of the controlled chaos with the calm alertness of someone whose training had prepared her for exactly this type of crisis. Her operational mind was already working through contingency protocols, assessing threats and calculating the probability of hostile intelligence services attempting to exploit her exposed status. Colonel Steele approached her with the measured steps of someone who recognized the gravity of what his intervention had cost. His decision to expose her identity had been made to prevent the injustice of stolen valor accusations, but the consequences extended far beyond the immediate social situation. "Alexandra," he said quietly, using her true name with the familiarity of someone who had commanded her during some of her most dangerous missions, "I'm sorry it came to this, but I couldn't stand by and watch that ignorant bastard destroy someone who's done more for this country than he could ever imagine." Rebecca met his gaze with the steady attention she had once focused on target assessment, her expression revealing neither anger nor gratitude. "Marcus, you made a command decision based on available information. The consequences are what they are." Her response demonstrated the psychological discipline that had made her so effective during her operational years, accepting reality without wasting emotional energy on circumstances beyond her control. But Steele could see the cost in her eyes, the recognition that 5 years of peaceful civilian existence had been sacrificed to protect her reputation from someone whose opinion ultimately meant nothing. Dr. Morrison found herself swept along with the security protocols despite her civilian status, her work with classified programs making her presence of interest to the military police officers conducting witness interviews. The elegant social evening had become an intelligence debriefing that would require extensive documentation and analysis. Dr. Morrison approached Agent Sarah Chun from the Defense Intelligence Agency, her credentials identifying her as someone authorized to handle the most sensitive aspects of the developing crisis. "We need to discuss what you observed this evening and any potential security implications from your perspective." The request was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were clear. Everyone who had witnessed Rebecca's exposure would need to be debriefed, their backgrounds investigated, and their future activities monitored to prevent intelligence leaks that could compromise ongoing operations. Major Kellerman remained under discreet but obvious surveillance, his earlier confidence completely evaporated as he began to understand the magnitude of his error. The woman he had accused of stolen valor had just been revealed as someone whose classified service record contained operations that would never be publicly acknowledged but had contributed significantly to national security. Captain Rodriguez approached him with the controlled movement of someone delivering an unwelcome but necessary message. "David," he said, using Kellerman's first name to emphasize the personal nature of what he was about to say, "you need to understand that your career is effectively over. What happened here tonight will follow you regardless of any official disciplinary action." Kellerman's face showed the devastation of someone whose ambitions had been destroyed by his own arrogance and poor judgment. "Jim, I was trying to protect military honor. How was I supposed to know she was some kind of classified operative? You weren't supposed to know, Rodriguez replied grimly. That was the entire point of her cover identity. Real operators don't advertise their achievements because doing so would compromise their ability to continue serving. The explanation highlighted the fundamental flaw in Kellerman's approach to identifying stolen valor. His assumption that genuine military heroes would display obvious signs of their service revealed a complete misunderstanding of how classified operations actually functioned. Colonel Hayes worked to coordinate the psychological support aspects of the crisis, her own intelligence background making her aware of the trauma that accompanied cover identity exposure. Rebecca's peaceful civilian life had been destroyed not through enemy action, but through the ignorance of someone she should have been able to trust. Alexandra, she said, approaching her friend with the concern of someone who understood both the operational and personal implications of what had occurred. We need to discuss immediate support resources. This kind of exposure can have psychological effects that don't manifest immediately. Rebecca's response demonstrated the professional competence that had made her so effective during her operational years. Patricia, I appreciate the concern, but right now we need to focus on damage assessment. My personal adjustment can be addressed once we understand the full scope of the security breach. Her prioritization of mission requirements over personal needs was characteristic of someone whose training had taught her to compartmentalize emotional responses during crisis situations. But Hayes could see the cost in her friend's controlled demeanor, the recognition that her carefully constructed normal life was gone forever. General Thompson coordinated with multiple agencies as the situation expanded beyond military jurisdiction into the realm of national intelligence. The exposure of a deep cover operative at a public event required coordination with CIA, NSA, and potentially the White House depending on what operations had been compromised. Sir, reported Colonel James Harrison from the Defense Intelligence Agency, preliminary assessment suggests that Captain Santos's exposure may compromise 3 ongoing operations and require the immediate extraction of at least 7 other personnel whose covers used similar protocols. The briefing highlighted the cascading effects of intelligence compromise, where a single breach could unravel carefully constructed networks that had taken years to establish. Rebecca's exposure was not just a personal tragedy, but a strategic setback that would require extensive resources to mitigate. Lieutenant Colonel Chun worked to manage the civilian aspects of the crisis, coordinating with the Veterans of Foreign Wars Foundation to minimize the political fallout from having a classified operative exposed at their gala. The organization's leadership would need to be briefed on classification protocols, while being prevented from discussing the incident publicly. General Thompson, she reported, the Foundation's executive director is requesting clarification about how to handle media inquiries about this evening's events. They're concerned about protecting both military honor and operational security. Thompson's response reflected the delicate balance required to manage public relations aspects of intelligence crises. Tell them that operational security takes precedence over publicity concerns. Any media statements will be coordinated through appropriate channels after damage assessment is complete. The hotel's management found themselves dealing with a situation they had never anticipated, as their elegant ballroom was transformed into an improvised secure facility with military police, establishing perimeters and intelligence officers conducting witness interviews. The disruption to their normal operations was significant, but cooperation with national security requirements was not optional. Rebecca observed the controlled chaos around her with the analytical detachment that had characterized her approach to hostile environments during her operational years. The familiar patterns of crisis response were almost comforting in their predictability, even though this particular crisis meant the end of everything she had built during her civilian life. Agent Martinez from the CIA's Operations Directorate approached with the measured pace of someone delivering information that would have significant implications for her immediate future. Captain Santos, we need to discuss immediate relocation protocols. Your current residential arrangements are no longer secure given tonight's exposure. The notification represented the practical reality of her situation. The apartment in Arlington, the job with the nonprofit, the carefully constructed relationships that had provided meaning during her civilian years were all now security liabilities that would need to be abandoned. Understood. Rebecca replied with the professional acceptance that had characterized her response to difficult assignments during her operational career. What's the timeline for extraction? We'll need you ready to move within 6 hours. The assumption is that hostile intelligence services will attempt to exploit this breach as quickly as possible. Her civilian life, built carefully over 5 years of patient reconstruction, would end before dawn. The books she had collected, the small garden she had tended, the veterans she had been helping transition to civilian careers, all would be abandoned as she returned to the shadows of denied operations and permanent exile from normal human connection. The irony was not lost on her that Major Kellerman's misguided attempt to protect military honor had destroyed the peaceful retirement of someone whose actual service had contributed more to national security than his own conventional deployment could ever achieve. But such ironies were common in the world of classified operations, where the greatest heroes remained unknown and the loudest advocates often understood the least about real sacrifice. As the evening progressed and the full scope of the security breach became clear, Rebecca began the psychological transition from civilian life back to the operational mindset that had once defined her existence. The woman who had found peace in helping other veterans would disappear as completely as if she had never existed, replaced by someone who would spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder and trusting no one completely. The extraction occurred with the silent efficiency that characterized all aspects of Rebecca's operational life. Her civilian possessions abandoned in the Arlington apartment that would be sanitized and forgotten by dawn. As black SUVs disappeared into the Washington night, carrying her toward another constructed identity in another anonymous city, the crystal ballroom was restored to its elegant emptiness as if the evening's events had been nothing more than a vivid dream. 6 months later, Major David Kellerman sat in the lobby of a Veterans Affairs office in Phoenix, his military career ended by an administrative discharge that cited conduct unbecoming, without specifying the classified details that had destroyed his future. The stolen valor accusations that had seemed so righteous in the moment had transformed him from a rising officer into a cautionary tale whispered in military circles about the dangers of arrogance exceeding wisdom. The veteran he was waiting to see emerged from an inner office with the quiet dignity that marked someone who had found peace with difficult circumstances. She wore simple clothes and practical shoes, her graying hair and modest appearance making her nearly invisible among the other people seeking assistance with their benefit claims. "Mr. Kellerman?" she said, her voice carrying no trace of recognition, despite the impossibility of forgetting the man who had destroyed her previous life. "I'm Sarah Wilson. I understand you're having difficulty transitioning to civilian employment." He looked up into dark eyes that seemed familiar yet completely unknown, searching for any sign that she remembered their encounter at the Pentagon gala. But Sarah Wilson's expression showed only professional concern for a veteran in need, without hint of the extraordinary past that linked them together. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly, his former arrogance replaced by the humility that came from having his assumptions about military service systematically demolished. "I'm having trouble explaining my discharge circumstances to potential employers." She nodded with understanding sympathy, making notes on his case file with the patient attention of someone who specialized in helping veterans rebuild their lives after career-ending mistakes. Military transitions are never easy, especially when circumstances are complicated. But everyone deserves a second chance to contribute meaningfully to society. The irony was perfect in its completeness. The woman he had accused of stolen valor was now helping him recover from the consequences of his own ignorance. Her new identity constructed around the same mission of veteran assistance that had characterized her previous civilian life. She had lost everything yet continued serving, while he had tried to protect military honor and destroy his own career in the process. Sarah Wilson maintained her professional demeanor throughout their hour-long session, never revealing that she remembered every detail of the evening that had shattered both their lives in different ways. Her ability to help someone who had caused her such damage demonstrated the kind of selfless service that truly characterized military honor, rather than the performative righteousness that had motivated his accusations. As Kellerman left the office with a job placement plan and renewed hope for his future, he never suspected that his rehabilitation was being managed by the same woman whose reputation he had tried to destroy. The quiet competence and genuine concern she had shown represented everything he had failed to understand about real military service during his years of conventional deployment. Sarah Wilson locked her office door and walked to her modest sedan. Another day of meaningful work completed in another carefully constructed civilian life. The apartment waiting for her contained different books and different furniture, but the same small garden where she found peace-tending plants that asked nothing of her except water and attention. Colonel Steele, now retired and working as a defense contractor, occasionally wondered what had happened to Captain Alexandra Santos after her extraction from the Pentagon gala. He hoped she had found another quiet corner of civilian life where her extraordinary service could remain appropriately forgotten, her sacrifices honored through anonymity rather than recognition. General Thompson included the incident in his classified memoirs as an example of how operational security could be compromised by the arrogance of officers who confused confidence with competence. The woman whose identity had been exposed represented everything admirable about military service, while her accuser had embodied its most dangerous tendencies. The lesson remained buried in classified files and whispered conversations, known only to those with sufficient clearance to understand its implications. That true military honor often hides in plain sight, wearing practical shoes and carrying itself with quiet dignity that ask for no recognition beyond the opportunity to continue serving others who need help finding their own paths to redemption. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance or quiet demeanor, only to discover they possessed extraordinary capabilities or achievements? Share your stories of unexpected heroes in the comments below. Whether it was a teacher who changed your life, a colleague whose hidden talents amazed you, or a stranger whose quiet competence solved the crisis. These stories remind us that real strength and honor don't always announce themselves with fanfare. If you found this tale of hidden service and mistaken identity compelling, subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of courage, sacrifice, and the unexpected. Heroes among us. Remember to hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads about the remarkable people who shape our world from the shadows. Asking for no recognition beyond the chance to serve others. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories belong to the most ordinary seeming people, and the greatest honor lies not in being recognized, but in the quiet dignity of service that continues regardless of acknowledgement.